Good afternoon. I'm Michael Ignatieff, Rector and President of CEU. I want to welcome welcome members of the CEU community, but I also want to welcome anybody from the Budapest community, from the Hungarian community, from our fellow colleagues and friends in Hungarian academic life. Bid you a warm welcome to our house. I want to welcome, there are a lot of very distinguished ambassadors in the front row, so we've got to be in our best behavior. But we welcome, as always, the diplomatic community in Budapest, who have been a constant presence in our events and always add greatly to them. And heaven knows what they report back to their home countries, but that makes it all kind of interesting. I hope CEU gets into your reports to your embassies. We have a very distinguished diplomat today, and I just want to welcome the United Kingdom Ambassador Iain Lindsay, a man of considerable diplomatic experience for his country, in the middle of what must be one of the most challenging roles that any diplomat could have. I will not dwell on that. That will come up in discussion, and Reinhard Bettzuege, who's also here and has made possible this series of ambassadorial lectures, and we thank Reinhard for his work, and he will moderate the question period. The one thing I would say about this particular topic is that, remember, the framing device of this series is about the national dreams of countries. And this is surely one of the most interesting cases in which a country, a great country with an incredible historical, scientific, cultural tradition, has got two competing dreams. One dream is a dream of national sovereignty outside the European Union. Many British people have conscientiously voted for that dream. Another portion of the British public have believed that the dream of the United Kingdom must be as a European state within a European set of institutions. This conflict between, there are many ways to think about the Brexit drama, but it is, I think, productive to think of it as a battle of competing dreams, in which people feel that the very soul of their country is at stake. I think the intensity of this debate is extremely important to anybody who loves the United Kingdom, as many of us do, but who is watching something of immense historical importance, a country literally debating its future in public, in a nasty, brawling, messy, complicated, detail-strewn debate that is a real test of one of the great European and global democracies. And so we all watch this with apprehension and concern, but also fascination, because whatever else this is, it's a test of how a democracy adjudicates between radically competing dreams. So I don't want to say anything more, but I couldn't resist pontificating on the subject, so I've just done so. And now I turn it over to Reinhard Bettzuege, and once again welcome Iain Lindsay, the British ambassador, for being here.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for the introduction. You may remember what happened in your country, in Canada, when Quebec had a national dream. And I think it was as close as the Brexit vote were this time. In our series of ambassadors' lectures in the SPP here in the School of Public Policy on dreams and politics, we heard from the horse's mouth how nations tick, how they planned their pursuit of happiness. To use the American example, we have heard about the Canadian dream, the Palestinian dream, the Slovak and Ukrainian dreams, indeed the American dream, also the Moldovan dream, and we will hear about the Czech dream on December 5. Today we are happy to hear from the British ambassador what dream his countrymen connect with Brexit. It could not have been more timely. The Brexit summit is scheduled for Sunday. Prime Minister Theresa May pretends that Brexit, and I quote her, will give Britain the freedom to deliver the British dream. End of quote. She presented an optimistic vision of how the divorce with Brussels will benefit the whole country. At the same time, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Philip Hammond, warned of dire consequences from crashing out of the EU. The Mayor of London called for a second Brexit referendum. So did about 750,000 demonstrators in London last week, to which Theresa May replied, and I quote her, "We gave the people the opportunity to make a choice. They made that choice." End of quote. Yes, but did they make that choice on a truly informed basis, or were they misled, even lied at, when they voted? How much populism was involved? The Guardian this week, 17th, commented, and I quote, "The political upheavals of the past week have surpassed in intensity and gravity almost anything the British people have experienced in the post-war era. Nobody knows how or where this tragedy, this black farce in which we gamble with a nation's life, will end." End of quote. And I add, Brexit does not only concern British lives, but the lives of all Europeans will be affected in one way or another. This takes me back to the days when I spent time in Britain as an exchange student, as a young boy, and how puzzled I was when I heard the weatherman in the radio announce that unfortunately for the weekend the continent would be cut off by fog. Now, after nearly 50 years of EU membership, Britain will be cut off from the continent by more than just fog. Can I quote the English Renaissance poet John Donne? "No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less." Iain Lindsay, British ambassador, is a brave man to come here. Brave heart to come here today to defend his Prime Minister's view. As a Scot, he may even have different private views, I don't know. Iain, the floor is yours. Take us on a soul-searching tour on Brexit.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Michael, Reinhard, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, thank you for inviting me here. This does feel a bit like coming into the lion's den on a day when we've had further political excitement with the news that last night Theresa May and Jean-Claude Juncker reached agreement on the text of the political declaration, which European leaders will be hopefully agreeing on Sunday. We do indeed live in interesting times. The last time I was in this room, I was talking about migration. I gave a TEDx talk here on the rational versus the irrational, and I had as my topic migration, and I felt as a migrant I could talk about that. It would be fair to say that I think in relation to Brexit as well, there is also the rational and the irrational, and indeed migration was indeed a feature of the British referendum back in 2016. But before rushing into trying to answer the question in the title of, not my title, I hasten to add, but the CEU title, British Dream, Brexit, British Dream or Nightmare, let me step back a bit and start from the beginning. So take you through some of what we've been doing just in terms of the negotiation, the hard facts. And then I'll reflect, if I may, on a few aspects of this, the question of whose dream are we talking about? Fundamentally, as has been pointed out already, British people took part in a huge democratic exercise. 33 million people voted in our referendum in 2016. The majority decided that we should leave. Clearly, the dream of the Brexiteers and the dream of the Remainers their dreams were quite different. But in a democracy, the government then has to try to decide to do what it has to do to fulfill the wishes of the people. And the one thing I would just point out before we start, because we've obviously had certain quotes put forward, including from The Guardian. By the way, I'd like to recommend to all of you, there's an excellent questionnaire in The Guardian at the moment. How populist are you? Yes, I'm not telling you where I came on that, but it is fair to say that at the general election in Britain last year, the two parties which gained 85% of the vote in that election were both committed to fulfilling the result of the referendum. And it's really important just to remember that. This is the Conservative Party and the Labour Party were committed to fulfilling the result of the referendum. Please bear that in mind when we talk about democracy and the will of the people. So let's step back then to June 2016, where we had the referendum on whether we should leave the European Union. 33 million people took part in that. It was, by any standards, a major exercise in democracy. Now, when people voted, the vote was an expression of how they wanted their democracy to work, how Britain's relationship with the European Union, what the relationship was that going to be. It would be fair to say then that the majority of people felt that they wanted more direct control of the decisions that affected their daily lives, something that they felt was being lost in the inevitable pooling of sovereignty that comes with membership of the European Union. They wanted more decisions to be made in the UK by people whom they saw as being more directly accountable to the British people. And I would just at this point say that it is a common feature not just of British elections, but elections throughout Europe, that the turnout for European elections is usually half of that we see for national elections. And that's the point about people being whether MEPs or MPs, that people do see their own members of parliament in their own national parliament as being people who are more accountable to them. I do not believe that the vote was a rejection of the values that we share as fellow Europeans. I don't believe it was an attempt to do harm to the European Union or to indeed any of the remaining member states. We are leaving the European Union, but as has been clear from the discussions that have dominated certainly British headlines over the last 2 years, particularly over the last couple of months, we want to remain committed partners and allies to our friends across the continent. Indeed, in today's interconnected world, I don't believe many people in the UK seriously believe that it makes sense to turn inwards. Promoting free trade, promoting the rules that govern international relations, enhancing global development, those are all in our national interest. Terrorism, crime, climate change, they don't respect national borders, so we have to work with others to continue to address all these issues and many more. Now, in our neighbourhood, that means continuing to work closely with the EU, whose member states are among our closest allies and partners. We are still proud to be a member of the European family of nations. We are not turning our back on Europe. Now, there might be some people in this room who think it would be a very good idea to tow our island somewhere into the middle of the Atlantic, maybe near Newfoundland, maybe near Bermuda. But the reality is our geography is as it is. We will still be a European country. We're leaving the European Union. We are not leaving Europe. Self-evidently, Norway, Switzerland, Russia, Serbia are no less European because they're not in the European Union. Before Hungary's entry into the European Union in 2004, I don't believe Hungarians felt themselves to be any less European, or Poles for that matter. We know that a successful European Union is profoundly in our national interest, and indeed that of the whole world. We want to build a deep and a special relationship so that we can continue to play a role in advancing European prosperity and security, but we don't want to be members of the European Union to do that. Now, in terms of the negotiations, which have been going now for just over 2 years, the first phase of the negotiations on our withdrawal finished at the end of last year. And the reality is that some of the issues of greatest concern to Hungarians and indeed to people in this region were actually settled quite a while ago. By the end of last year, we had made progress on what was the first priority, not just for the European Union, but also for the United Kingdom, namely a fair and reciprocal agreement to protect citizens' rights and allow British citizens in the EU, roughly 1.3, 1.4 million people, and the 3.8 million European Union citizens in the UK to continue to live their lives broadly as before. We also reached agreement nearly a year ago on a financial settlement of around about £40 billion, which Britain will be paying to the European Union to honour the commitments we have undertaken as members of the European Union, and also take into account the fact that there will be continuing programmes in which we wish to take part. And we made some progress by then on the Northern Ireland border issue. Our departure causes particular challenges that we've had to discuss with the Irish government, with our EU partners. The main objective on both sides has been to avoid any physical infrastructure at the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. We then reached agreement in March of this year on another important element, namely an implementation period. We agreed the terms of a time-limited implementation period that starts on the 30th of March next year and lasts until the 31st of December 2020. Now, we cease to be legally a member of the European Union on the 29th of March next year, but common rules will remain in place until the end of the implementation period, meaning that citizens and businesses in the UK and across the EU can plan for life after our withdrawal at the end of 2020. Now, I know that not just the many Hungarians in the UK, but citizens from across the European Union have family and friends in the United Kingdom, have been concerned about what will happen to them after we leave the European Union. And the reality is that no EU national currently in the UK needs leave the United Kingdom when we exit the EU. Moreover, the deal that we reached with the European Commission will be extended to those who arrive during the implementation period. And the only difference is that people who arrive after we have legally left the European Union, so de jure we are no longer a member of the European Union, is that those who arrive after that time, but during the implementation period, will need to register after having been in the UK for 3 months. And after 5 years residence in the UK, they can apply for settled status. Now, the UK remains one of the most open and welcoming places in the world. That was a main theme of the TEDx talk that I gave here. Our capital, London, the largest city in Western Europe, 8 million people, 40% of whom were born overseas, I think reflects the fact that we are and have been, and I think will continue to be, an open and welcoming society. We value the contribution that European Union citizens and indeed people from all around the world make to the UK. This is true, for example, for our world-class universities. We are the second most popular destination globally after the US for international students, and we do not want that to change. Which is why, in relation, and particularly as I'm here today, why we agreed in 2017 that EU students would remain eligible for undergraduate, master's, postgraduate and advanced learner financial support for this academic year. And then in July of this year, we announced that that would continue to apply for the next academic year, 2019-2020. And that applies in England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. As Alistair Jarvis, the Chief Executive of Universities UK, said, EU students make an important contribution to our universities, enriching our campuses culturally and academically. So last week, we made a decisive step forward in the negotiations. We agreed in principle with the European Union the terms of our exit from the European Union, and that was then agreed by the British Cabinet. This means that the full legal text of the 585-page withdrawal agreement has been now agreed in principle, securing the rights of EU citizens living in the UK and the UK nationals living in the EU, setting out the terms of a time-limited implementation period and ensuring a fair financial settlement. A protocol on Northern Ireland was also agreed in principle with an explicit recognition that it can only be temporary, and both sides intend to replace it by arrangements over the next 2 years. It ensures that the UK can choose to request either an extension of the implementation period or enter into a backstop arrangement with the EU if the agreement in our future relationship, which we'll be negotiating over the next 2 years, if that is not ready by the end of December 2020. The proposal for a Northern Ireland-only customs element of the backstop, which was originally proposed by the Commission, has been replaced by a UK-wide solution, guaranteeing no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland and respecting the constitutional and economic integrity of the UK. Now, the withdrawal agreement legally commits both sides, the UK and the EU, to use their best endeavours to ensure that the backstop is never used. We don't want to use it, the European Union doesn't want to use it, and we will be negotiating to that end over the next 2 years. If either side fails to use its best endeavours to that end, this can be referred to an independent arbitration panel. So, as both Theresa May and Michel Barnier, the EU's chief negotiator, have recognised, this was a decisive step that allowed us to move on and finalise the deal on our exit from the EU. Which brings us to the future relationship and the slightly shorter 20-odd page document that was agreed last night between Theresa May and Jean-Claude Juncker, which essentially is the roadmap for our future relationship. The political declaration. So on Sunday, when European Union leaders meet, they have 2 documents to agree. The 585-page withdrawal agreement, essentially the divorce agreement, and the 25, 26, 27-page political declaration, which essentially is the roadmap for the sort of relationship, economically and in terms of security, that the UK and the EU wish to have for the future. And the idea is that over the next 2 years, negotiators on both sides will negotiate in detail those future security and economic relationships. The political declaration signals the ambition of both sides to embark on a new, deep and special relationship after we leave the EU. Now, the reality is it reflects the evolution in both sides' position since the beginning of the negotiations and demonstrates a joint commitment to develop a future partnership that fully reflects the depth of our shared history and our values and supports our interconnected economies and security. So what does that mean? Well, the British Parliament is actually now debating the declaration, or at least debating we're having discussions in Parliament about the declaration. We have agreed on the creation of a free trade area for goods, combining deep regulatory and customs cooperation with, for example, zero tariffs, no fees, no charges, no quantitative restrictions across all goods sectors. That is the first such agreement, or would represent, when it's negotiated in detail, the first such agreement between an advanced economy and the EU. Common ground has also been reached on our intention to have a close relationship on services and investment, including financial services, on the desire for wide-ranging sectoral cooperation in areas such as transport and in energy, and on fisheries, recognising the UK will be an independent coastal state. Important consensus has also been reached on key elements of our future internal security partnership. There will be swift and effective extradition arrangements. We will continue data exchange, fingerprints, DNA, vehicle records, as well as passenger name records. And on foreign security and defence policy, we have agreed arrangements for consultation and cooperation on sanctions, participation in EU missions and operations, defence capability development, and exchange of intelligence. Now, over the last week, negotiations have continued to finalise that final political declaration that was agreed last night, adding some more detail, defining further what balance of rights and obligations should apply, for example, in the context of trade in goods, identifying which additional operational capabilities should be prioritised for consideration in the context of our internal security cooperation. But as you know, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. We need the political declaration on our future relationship to be agreed in order to finalise the withdrawal agreement. Both the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration now agreed in principle, politically. The stage is now set for Mrs. May and the leaders of the EU 27 at their special European Summit meeting on Sunday to agree this package. That's the easy part. Once agreed, assuming agreed, the final deal will be put to the British Parliament and MPs will have to decide whether to back or reject it. But they should be under no illusions that the EU will be prepared to start all over again and negotiate a different deal. As I said to European Union ambassadors who had a meeting yesterday with Peter Szijjártó, the Hungarian foreign minister, if I had a crystal ball, I would not be a diplomat. The banking sector or the stock exchange or the foreign exchange markets would be a far better bet. So I will not and I cannot predict what is going to happen when the British Parliament, the mother of parliaments, sits down to debate this, probably in the first week of December. But as Michael has already highlighted, this is an issue which divides both the major parties. The Conservative Party and the Labour Party are split on the issue. There is a huge amount of speculation as to which way the numbers will go. Will, for example, in the light of assuming there is an agreement on Sunday between the 28 member states, the EU 27 and the UK, will we see, for example, European socialist and liberal leaders appealing to their counterparts in the UK to back the deal on the basis that this is the only deal on offer? We shall see. We firmly believe that it is in the interest of both the EU and the UK to agree a deal. And I think it is worth bearing in mind that the EU have been negotiating with us on this on behalf of the 27 member states. This is an agreement between us and the EU. It is obviously the responsibility of, or the duty of any responsible government also to prepare for a range of potential outcomes, including what we regard now as the unlikely event of no deal. And we've been preparing work on that for the last 2 years in the event that there were to be no deal. No deal is not what we want, and indeed now it is not what we expect. We think that with the agreement that we have signed, agreed at least in principle, politically, and that hopefully we will get agreement to on Sunday, we now have a deal in place that enables us to leave the European Union on the 29th of March next year. So, what next? Well, going back to the theme of British dream or British Brexit dream or Brexit nightmare, let me quote Frida Kahlo, the Mexican artist whose works have recently been exhibited in Budapest. "I don't paint dreams or nightmares. I paint my own reality." Now, the majority of British people voted for creating a new political reality. And frankly, the depth of our relationship with Hungary and other European countries is not solely dependent on our joint membership of the EU, but a whole range of other aspects, our history, our values, and our common interests. I don't believe that our departure from the EU will seriously mean that the UK is no longer a gateway to the rest of the world. Be it for, let's say, a Hungarian startup that wants to access our innovation ecosystem or the global market, a student who wants to study at a UK university, a researcher who wants to work with British research institutions on a whole range of areas from data science to medical research. I frankly don't believe that that will change. So let me now step back from my script as the British ambassador and maybe in line with the theme of the talk, or at least aspects of the talk that I gave here a few months ago on migration, just give you a personal assessment as we look at this. I've got no qualms in saying to you, because I've said it many times before, and I think I've actually said it on Hungarian television, that personally I voted to remain in the European Union. But also I live in a democracy. And I think there are questions to be asked when people say that we should have a second referendum. The reality is, in all Western democracies, in other words, in all democracies, but maybe particularly in Anglo-Celtic democracies, where there is a good deal of political thrust and parry across the debating floor, in all of our democracies, people go forward with manifestos and say, if you elect me, I will do this. If you elect me, this will happen. Now, obviously, if I was to give a brand or a slogan to both what the Brexiteers wanted and what the British people voted for, it would be taking back control. Now, a very well-known British academic, Matthew Goodwin, who's Professor of Political Science at the University of Kent in Canterbury, has done a huge amount of research into this. Indeed, the Chancellor of his university, Bob Worcester, who heads up the Mori polling organisation, is currently in Budapest, and we were speaking about this last night. People voting for Brexit, if you look at the mind maps of people who voted for Brexit and the people who voted to remain, for the Brexiteers, there is no doubt that the word migration is right up there in headlights and in the forefront of their thinking. Migration, the sort of society that we have, there was a lot of concerns about the future. For many of the Remainers, their focus was very much more on economic issues, prosperity. And of course, we then had a campaign where we had people on two sides speaking different languages. So Remainers were speaking the language of people that wanted to remain, prosperity, saving jobs, and Brexiteers were largely talking about the things such as taking back control of migration, laws. Largely, if we look back at the campaign, if we're honest, there wasn't very much reaching out to people on the other side. And I think you already alluded, Michael, to the fact that I think not just in Britain, but it's, I think, an increasing issue across Western democracies, is that people are speaking to the converted. You're speaking to your own kind. As we say in Scotland, your ain folk. And are not actually trying to speak out or reach to people on the other side. It's quite interesting, if you have a look, for those of you who have done the Guardian populist questionnaire or poll, there was a question about whether, do you regard people who hold different views from you as evil? Do you remember that? Interesting. I could not imagine that 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, you would seriously be asking in a democracy whether you view people who hold different views as being evil. But I think it is a fact that we are in a period of our political history where there is a lot of division in society. And I think one of the things I would agree with Matthew Goodwin on, as he has analysed the votes, why people voted as they did, is that despite the calls of 750,000 protesters in London 2 weeks ago, and my son was one of them, the reality is that most polls continue to show a country deeply divided on this issue. It is we haven't moved to a situation where you can honestly say that 60% of Brits would now vote to stay in and 40% would leave, or vice versa. And indeed, speaking to a number of British politicians who are Remainers, and are very still, sore at the fact that we're leaving, but they say, frankly, for Britain now to try to reverse the referendum result because the people got it wrong the first time round could do huge damage to our democracy. And indeed, I've read many articles in The Guardian and The New Statesman and The Independent reflecting from people, if you like, from the centre of left of politics, you might say natural Remainers, saying we have to be very, very careful about re-examining and opening this issue up again in the sense of having a people's vote. We had a people's vote, it was called a referendum, 33 million people took part. So we have, I think, got some serious issues to contend with. We haven't, I think, over the last 2 years really reached out and understood better the perspectives of people on the other side. Matthew Goodwin, the academic from the University of Kent, thinks this has been a lost opportunity. And I think maybe if we look back in a few years' time at this period, I think we may well come to that same conclusion. In terms of the motivation, the dreams, I mean, I don't think at this stage, I don't think we can honestly say, I'm not dreaming of a nightmare. I think the people who wanted us to leave the European Union are getting what they wanted in the deal. It is a reality that in the referendum campaign, there was not a huge amount of detail on issues such as customs union, hard border, paying money to the European Union. I don't think that was not the sort of level of detail that we saw. When people stand up and say, this is not what British people voted for, I'd say, wait, hold your horses. People voted to leave the European Union. They've now left it to politicians, to elected politicians, to their government, to negotiate that. Because this wasn't a unilateral, this is not a unilateral negotiation. We're negotiating with the European Union, 27 other member states. Inevitably in that, there would have been for both sides, and there have been for both sides, compromises. So we have now got, we hope, a deal that has been negotiated. It means that we leave the European Union. That was the number one priority, I guess, for people who voted to leave. The freedom of movement of labour, in other words, the migration-related issue, and I completely accept that migration to the UK from the European Union has been European Union citizens exercising their rights as European Union citizens to live, work and study wherever they like in the European Union. But if you like, we will no longer have freedom of movement of labour, and therefore we will in effect be taking back complete control of people coming into the UK. Because the reality is that for the last few decades, we have had freedom of movement of labour from the European Union, but we have had control systems, visa systems, for people coming from the rest of the world into the UK. I do not believe, incidentally, that after the end of the implementation period, when Britain will bring in a new migration policy, I think Britain will still be a welcoming country. I suspect we'll end up with an immigration system similar to that of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, a system based essentially on skills, experience, and talent, because we are a growing society. By the year 2050, Britain will overtake Germany as the most populous country in Europe. We need migration. Not a message that goes down very well here in this part of Europe very often, but we support migration, we believe in orderly migration, and we will be able to do that ourselves after the end of the implementation period when we bring in our new migration system. In terms of taking back control over, so we've talked about we leave the EU on migration, we will no longer be paying money into the European Union budget. We will no longer have the direct control of the European Court of Justice over our system, which has been an issue which has exercised many politicians, including, I have to say, many politicians from the Remain camp. The idea that Britain was neatly divided between Brexiteers and Remainers 2.5 years ago, or even now, is a myth. The reality is that many people on the Remain side, which is why David Cameron tried to renegotiate a deal with the EU, felt that they wanted to see a change to that relationship between the UK and the EU, but continuing as a member state. But that is not happening. But that certainly is an area which, on the role of the European Court of Justice, there was, even amongst people who were pro-EU, there were concerns about that. So, the dreams that we have, inevitably, in terms of a government trying to do its best following a referendum which had a very clear split in the British people, 51-49%, of trying to deliver a deal that is essentially good for the UK. But obviously, on the other side of the fence, we've had the Commission negotiating on behalf of the EU 27 for a deal that is good for the EU. So what we have got that has been agreed is a compromise. Whether the British Parliament will see this as fulfilling the Brexit dream remains to be seen. But inevitably, for the British government over the last 2 years, and I think this is really important to remember this in a democracy with an elected government, trying to achieve the best possible outcome for the UK. Because at the end of the day, and as Michael knows from his time in the House of Commons in Ottawa, you have to get a majority of people voting for you in Parliament to achieve this. Now, you may say to me, Ambassador, your arithmetic needs to be looked at, or your maths needs to be looked at. Who can tell what will happen in the Mother of Parliaments over the next few weeks? But in terms of the first stage of this process, we have something which people thought would not be the case. I've sat in numerous halls in the last 2 years, universities. I've been on television more times than I'd like to have been, being interviewed about Brexit. People saying, you're not going to reach an agreement. You've been negotiating for a year, 18 months. Where's the agreement? Well, what is by any standard is probably the most complex international negotiation that certainly Britain has had to deal with in its history, for possibly the most, one of the most serious political issues for Britain since the Second World War, surpassing, I would suggest, the Suez Crisis in 1956. We now have got a draft agreement between the EU and the UK on the withdrawal deal, the divorce, and giving the outline of the future relationship. It is now over to the British Parliament, and indeed obviously for the other 27 member states, to ratify the agreement. And for those of you who don't know quite how the House of Commons will deal with this, it is a long parliamentary road. There are 3 parliamentary processes that will need to be completed before the 29th of March. The first one is the so-called meaningful vote on the deal. Yes or no? Do you want it or do you not want it? If Parliament votes for the deal, the government will then need to bring forward enabling legislation to put the deal into law. So the first vote is purely one, if you like, a political vote. Do we like it or don't we like it? If they accept it, they vote for the deal, you then need legislation that will need to go through Parliament. And then, because this is an international treaty, we then, under British legislation, we need to lay the treaty before the Parliament for 4 working weeks. So the 29th of March suddenly rolls forward to basically, we have to have this tied up by the middle of February. And in between, we have Christmas and New Year to look forward to. Thank you very much.